Welcome to Human Rights Education Now, a podcast series from Human Rights Educators USA. I'm your host, Bill Fernikes, a member of the National Steering Committee of HRE USA, a collaborative network that learns, teaches, organizes, advocates, and innovates for human rights education in the United States. This podcast aims to raise awareness about human rights education and invites listeners to engage with the worldwide movement to make human rights education a core focus of educational programs from preschool through higher education and in both non-formal and informal community educational settings. This episode continues and concludes our conversation with Marissa Gutierrez-Vicario, Director of Arte Justice and co-chair of the HRE USA National Steering Committee. Marissa discusses how human rights education must be focused not only on global but local issues in the United States, along with insights about human rights education and how it can be advanced in the U.S. despite long-standing obstacles to its implementation. Now, you've worked in interfaith projects for some time, and can you talk a little bit about the spiritual journey and its relationship to human rights for you?
Yes. So I grew up Catholic. I think if you were to ask me today, and this is not 100% what you're asking, but I think it's important for the context of the question. I now identify like a Christian, Unitarian Universalist, like faith, I guess, in terms of if someone were to ask me. So I say this in terms of as a teenager, I grew very interested in Unitarian Universalism just because of the direct connection with social justice, similar to the Quakers, in terms of, and I know that's a huge social justice, faith-based organization. I spent a lot of time in some way I have like connections with Unitarians. My first job out of college was working at their youth office that no longer exists, but now at their national office. So, definitely interested in like youth and youth development. But like I mentioned, I think I wouldn't be the activist I was today if it wasn't for that faith. So I'm really grateful to that. And also, what I appreciate about Unitarians is, especially in the U.S. context at least, is like working towards, again, not perfect and a lot of work yet to be done, but really striving towards anti-racism and anti-oppression efforts. So that was something that like I was trained in and like learned about, and to this day still work with. There's a College of Social Justice which I really love, and I've learned from really, really incredible activists doing work, doing delegations, doing work. So that's always been a part of my journey. And from me in those spaces, I've led trips with other really amazing activists. A lot of our work has been like, helping others reflect, right? Whether they've been in Haiti, Nicaragua, Honduras, that we've worked in those spaces, reflection, but that also has given me a moment to also reflect from myself in terms of why am I doing the work that I'm doing? Why is this important? That's come up a lot, especially as I worked with people on the border but also worked in jails, and like in terms, I think you always, part of that faith, part of that spirituality is like, why are we doing the work that we're doing? What motivates us to continue? Sometimes there's no easy answers to that, but I think this work has allowed me to be, I have a lot of work to do on that, but it has pushed me to be like, okay, I can't ask people to reflect if I'm not reflecting on this myself.
So as a leader of HRE USA, you worked a lot to try to focus our work in the organization on social justice.
Yes.
Particularly with populations of color. How do you feel the organization is doing in that regard at this point in time?
And I say this with love and affection, and I think we have a lot of work to do, and that's on all of us. And I say this just because, I getting people involved. Let me backtrack a little bit. The folks that work with HRE USA, do a lot of thankless volunteer work, right? So I think in asking people to come involved, while everyone, our work always wanting to invite and bring new people on. We're asking people like, come and join this work. It's thankless. Oftentimes we won't see the fruits of it for years to come. It's without compensation. All of this, right? So I think that's huge to ask, right? And that's huge. So, and also it's really important that we're bringing in, continuing to bring and involve diverse leaders. Whether it is across like folks of different racial backgrounds, abilities, age, all these kind of things. So I think we're working on it. I do think that we need to continue to be explicit about this. In terms of like, I know that it's not our sole, I'll put it this way, it's not our sole focus in terms of like, there's other organizations that do really important racial justice work. And also, I think in the context that we live in, like, we also can't separate that either. Like everything that we do, in my opinion, like everything we do needs to be anti-racist, needs to be like, with Arte, that's important. Like, I want to push, I'm not saying that HRUSA does this, but I do want, as for Arte, at least I'll say, like, I don't think like celebrating Black lives and like honoring Black artists shouldn't be something reserved for just a month, right? Like it shouldn't just, this is something that we're striving to do across all of our work, across like all of our social media, across all of the, who our young people learn about as an artist, right? Who our young people, see in our social media, who, as a board, like, so those are, I guess, I'm working as a leader to make sure that it's a part of our very being and principles. And while acknowledging that, there are other organizations that we also should and can uplift and support who are doing this work explicitly in terms of, like, I think of, yeah, so I'll stop right there. But like, so I think that's something that I'm hoping to support, HRUSA to do, because, it's like, it's not separate, but also there are ways that we can infuse it in the ways that are a part of our makeup and a part of who we are and our values, which we talk about and we try to live in everything that we do. So sorry, I got off. There's so many thoughts I have about that.
That's okay.
But yeah.
Let me follow up. Do you believe, for example, there should be more explicit partnerships between HRE USA and advocacy groups, let's say in Native American communities and African American communities, Latino communities that are doing social justice work?
Yeah, and actually, that was one thing I was going to mention. Like, definitely partnerships, amplifying work when appropriate and necessary. I think that's part of the work, right? In terms of like, partnering, understanding what people are doing. And I think, and this has happened to me a lot of my life, people are doing really incredible human rights work or human rights education work. They may not call it that either, but it doesn't mean they're not doing it, and doesn't mean that we can't support it. So yeah, absolutely. But also like thinking about meaningful ways, making it sure that we're not tokenizing people, making it sure, and not that we do, but these are things that come up. Making sure that it feels authentic. Also, learning when, like, if we offer partnerships and like people are saying, no, this is not the time or place, like that's also okay too, right? Like, and honoring that, right? So I do think that we have folks in our community who are doing that and building authentic community partnerships and doing that work, noticed and unnoticed and things like that. But overall, we can always do better.
So, if you look at the idea of human rights, I'm using the Tip O'Neill quote here, that all politics have been local. Would you say that all human rights education is local? And if so, why?
Yeah. Yes, and also I know people also like the word glocal, global and local. They love that. So absolutely, just what we just mentioned, like in terms of supporting oftentimes local leadership of color, and like and that is local, and I also found like we did a workshop this Saturday. I won't go into too many details about it, but like we were working with students and we were talking about these concepts. Some of it was about abolition and mass incarceration, and they understood it, but someone asked a question about like, well, what does this mean in your own school? What does this mean in your own, like, that's when it and the conversation started going, like, and couldn't stop. And I really was so appreciative of that conversation. And that was because it was localized, right? Like, like I have no doubt that students, anyone, understands at these larger levels and want to care, but it does have to start, inherently we're in like human beings like themselves or like talking about themselves sometimes. So I've noticed, they need examples. We need examples in terms of, and if we look outside our local community first, that's really important. And then also one can make the argument like, you need to, why would you go into someone else's backyard without addressing the issues in your own backyard first, right? And of course, there's international partnerships and coalitions and solidarity movements of that course, but also I think I think anyone would agree. A part of those movements, we need to also look at ourselves first, and I think if once we do that, we'll see a lot of commonalities. I always say that human rights don't exist in vacuums, right? So, like again, Black Lives Matter movement. We saw what was happening in our own communities and has been happening. People have been talking about this for a long time, even before. I want to acknowledge that, but then also seeing the global movement of people who have been feeling like wanting to talk about this and wanting to engage at this global level too. So it's all there.
I think it's interesting you mentioned that direct connection. When I used to teach a class on the Holocaust, I found the most powerful way to reach the students was to go through personal narratives, because the monumentality of the events was incomprehensible in some ways. But when you get it to a personal level, I think it becomes much more understandable, and the pain and the experiences become much more visceral.
Yeah, and that's where art becomes important too, right? Like, and again, ways that feel respectful and people who want to share their stories. But yeah, when people look at art, they hear stories. They see it becomes a very like personalized. It becomes easier to understand as opposed to a large statistic. So I think when you think of millions being killed, I can't even imagine what that is, like, but if you can see it like, the idea of like, this could be your neighbor, your friend, and I wish we lived in a world where that wasn't necessary. We didn't have to like humanize in that way, but we do. And that's okay. If that helps move people to action in some way.
So you've worked in the field for a number of years now, and if you think about the context of the United States, what are some sort of key insights or conclusions that you think are essential for HRE to move forward in this country?
Yeah, and some of these we really touched on, so I apologize. Again, this idea that like learning and taking, and I think there's an aspect of humility, right? Where, learning from organizers, especially people of color, organizers, and like learning from people who are most directly impacted. I think that is really important. And that's going to help move us forward in terms of HRE in this country. Also, I think there's this aspect, and I'm also going to give you the like what I feel like in the art background. And I mean, I also think that people, I think I say that art manifests hope and hope manifests justice. So I do think people need to continue, and people have been doing this, but like, continue to rely on art and creativity and imagination, because this work is really, really hard, and really, it's very easy to get like numb. And so, it's very easy, especially if you're not directly impacted. I think in some ways it's easy to turn off, and so I think using art as a way to continue to inspire hope and joy, I think people need that infused in these movements if they're going to be sustainable for the long run. And you mentioned Dolores Huerta earlier. It's actually funny. I forget. So I think it's actually going to be her birthday within the next day or two. I think she's going to turn 93. So I always say that like I get very tired and burnt out, but Dolores Huerta has been doing this like work double my lifetime. Like you know what I mean? Like it's very admirable and very powerful. So I think taking that, and I imagine also, I mean, I don't know her like what she does, like in terms of how she like her own personal self-care. That's personal, but like, I think thinking about ways that we're going to do this for the long run, right? Like I would love to be 93 if I have the privilege of, and be able to still do this work, right? So I think that's really important.
So if you think about the way in which we're dealing in this country with a whole series of human rights crises, whether it's violence against minorities and migrants and refugee rights, academic freedom, censorship. Um, what do you see as the role of the federal government? Because state governments have their own agendas and their own focus, but the federal government is actually signatory to a number of these treaties, international treaties. So, what would you like to see the federal government be doing to advance human rights education, particularly in light of all these crises in the country?
And I'm gonna be honest with you, I don't know if I can answer that great, but I would imagine, like, we talk to students about, being signatories of different things. You just mentioned that as well. Like, we were talking recently about the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Like that, for one, is something, and I know a lot of it is symbolic in many ways, as but also that symbolism can go a long way, in terms of like, this is our government, is, we're actively encouraging this. I think that would impact also, like when you think about like, again, incarceration, thinking about like children who've been incarcerated, solitary confinement, those things. So I mean, I would love to see, obviously, those, like when I think about solitary confinement, like not existing, like on a federal level, obviously. Of course, we see it on the state level, and people have fought very hard for those, like to, for like young, people to not be incarcerated, like in New York State, like, banning certain things, but like, I would, as a human rights educator, I'd love to see this as well on a federal level. So again, I'm not really answering your question 100%, but like to be able to honor human rights and honor human rights education at this larger level, which I hope would like inspire, on the states, but also that's a hard for me to think about too, because one thing I wanted to mention as well is like when I think about governance, I am really worried as an educator in New York of what is happening on different state levels. Then, like, I one example, like I think about a lot about Florida. I spent a little time in Florida during the pandemic. Like, um, you know, I think it goes without saying, we're living in different worlds, not even just different like states, different worlds. So again, I can't speak so much for the federal government, but I can speak in terms of educators thinking about these issues on this larger level. Um, I think HRU is really great about this, but also, what support can we offer states, who have like CRT bans, right? Like what are we actually doing? We have a lot of issues to face within our own states, and by no means we're perfect, but I do think that there are ways that we can, again, continue to build coalitions, learn from the folks that are actually in these states and figuring out what they need from their counterparts. So that's the way I'm kind of thinking about things right now. Otherwise, maybe I would be different and thinking about, my role differently, but that's kind of what I want to see, not just from the federal government, but what do we as educators, what can we offer and support with?
Yeah, because we have a decentralized education system in this country, it's not like in France where there's a Ministry of Education and they have a unified system. But I think you're onto something, that the idea being we can offer support, critical resources for dealing with a number of these threats. I mean, I'll give you a personal example. When I was teaching at Rutgers in teacher preparation, which I'm not doing anymore, people would ask me, well, I might want to move to Florida to teach. I say, fine. But today, if they actually asked me that question, I would say, you really have to think about that.
Absolutely.
Because of the threats to academic freedom and because of the limitations they're trying to impose, centralized limitations on freedom of thought.
Yeah. Yeah. And I honor that you said that. And also it makes, like, where does that leave the folks there, right? Like, I think about that a lot.
Yeah.
Like, so, part of us, I mean, I'm saying this as a part of a podcast, but, I would like to see, for Arte, even though we're still grassroots and very small, maybe we offer more support for folks, across we did try a national program, but like I think we want to build this up a little bit more, but that takes also building time and coalition and actually reaching out, and that's a lot. So yeah.
So as we turn to our last set of questions, which are common for each podcast, let me start with the one that we begin with, which is, who would be the most influential role model for your HRE work? That could be a person who's alive or deceased.
Who would be the most influential?
Yes.
This might sound a little, no, I mean, it's good. I think it's great. I honestly, it's like it's the young people I work with, really. Like they're inspiring. They influence like how I think about things. They like we have a junior board right now. So it's a group of young folks, and we're still building it. It's still really hard, and but they just started doing workshops, and like they really want to do workshops to help other young people learn about things. And again, I know it's still a learning process for them, but to see such a deep desire to do things on top of school, on top of graduating, on top of the jobs that they carry, that's very inspiring, right? So yeah, and I can't wait to see what they will be when they get. I mean, no, I say that like I'm so excited to see who they are now, and I can't wait to see what they'll do more, because it's like they're still amazing, and they will be more amazing. So that's really inspiring for me. That keeps me going. That is my hope. Like again, I love art. I love the work that I do, but also like I don't want to be executive director forever either. I don't think I don't think I should. So I'm hoping that whoever comes next. My hope, if we have the honor of keeping on longer, that would be amazing, and then also to have a young person continue this work.
So what quote most effectively sums up your view of the importance of human rights?
I was gonna use the quote that I said earlier, but maybe change it a little bit. So I think art manifests hope, and and hope manifests human rights. So yeah, I think so I think that's important, but I feel kind of weird. That's a quote that I felt like that feels very but I think it's only the reason is the one I could remember. But I like Eleanor Roosevelt has amazing quotes about like human rights. Like again, I'd have to pull it up. I'm sorry, I don't have that up with me, but like human rights being everywhere, like on this local level. So I'm not gonna mess up people's quotes, so that's why I chose my own. So sorry, but 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 yeah, like I love this idea again of this idea of language, right? And being able to empower folks to be able to. It's a tool that everyone can and should use. One question we often ask folks is like, we ask them like, what is the one thing you should be in order to have human rights, right? And we're like, just to be human. So I love that aspect of being able to go and engage young people, and like, again, even though it's not a perfect system, and even though obviously there's human rights violations, to know that this exists is very it's very inspiring.
And last but not least, if you had the power to make one critical change to advance HRE in this country, what would you do? Just one.
It's really hard. For HRE education, just so that everyone had equal access to that. So I guess what I mean by that is like, I think sometimes I've talked to people and their human rights education has started in graduate school, right? Or it's the first time they ever learned about the UDHR. And I want that to change. Like, again, I mentioned like we work in jail sometimes, and we actually introduced the UDHR to some folks there. And there was one person, I remember, I'll never forget, they like wrote down they copied down every article, and they just wrote it down, and to me, like I was very touched by that. I don't know, there's this moment of like, and what that meant in the context of somewhere where people don't have any rights, right? So like, to be able to have access to this, and then, sorry, I'm going to cheat a little bit, but also the idea of people just being free in general, right? So like, that, like I paint this picture of someone writing down the rights in a jail cell, but I don't want them to be there at all. So for me, so like just being able to, or being able to understand their rights outside of the context too. So I hope that made sense. But like, I want people to know their rights, but also want them to have them and have quality access to them, regardless of the context that you're in.
So freedom from oppression.
Yeah.
And be able to exercise their rights without fear.
Without fear. Yeah. And being able to live to the fullest potential, I think, for some folks, or for all folks, but especially for folks who have had that taken away.
Well, I would say that if people looked at your example, then that's a good way to proceed, because you're a living example of that, trying to help people do that. And I'm very happy that we had this conversation today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And it's always a pleasure to speak with you.
Okay. And thank you very much, Marissa, and I wish you the best.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Human Rights Education Now. You can find additional information about this podcast series at www.hreusa.org. Each episode is available on the HRE USA podcast page, Spotify, Apple and Google Podcasts, and Deezer. They will soon be available on YouTube and SoundCloud. You can also download each episode as an MP3 file. If you have questions or comments about this podcast, send them to Christy at hreusa.org. That's KRISTI@hreusa.org. Our podcast team includes producer and editor Bill Fernikes, executive producer Christy Redelius-Palmer, editor Elizabeth Schwab, sound designer and project manager Sabrina Sanchez, and production coordinator Jasmine Chizu Gotan. Human Rights Education Now is a production of Human Rights Educators USA, a project of the Center for Transformative Action in Ithaca, New York.